How's it? Here we go. Chapter 14. Let's get our teas brewing. Got myself some milk today, so I'm happy. What a great sound. Alright. Alright. Here we go. Chapter 13. Okavango. Lord, how thou art changed. How dost thou and thy master agree? The Merchant of Venice, Shakespeare. I really liked Shakespeare, doesn't he? Especially the Merchant of Venice. all during my matric year, Wally Cooks and I planned an expedition into the Okavango swamps. Wally lived in Francistown, and his dad had made many safaris to the edge of the swamps and into the Kalahari Desert. From all the stories he had told us in the past, we were keen to get out there and make a few of our own. We spent nights writing lists of things we should take, the dreaming taking us off into realms unknown to others and to ourselves. By the time the end of year came, everyone at Helderberg knew that we were going to go on an expedition into the swamps of the Okavango. Scholastically, things didn't go too well. I had planned to go to Cape Town University and take medicine, so I could be just like Dad. I had done so many operations with them by now that I was an accomplished assistant and loved doing surgery. Little did I know the amount of reading that had to be done to be a doctor. I was so slow at reading that I just gave up. All I did in classes was to listen, and my retention was alright, so I was able to get through my exams. Later, they discovered that I had dyslexia, something I never considered a handicap, only a nuisance. When it came to writing my matric exams, I passed at everything except French, a language that I spoke on a regular basis with my friend, Pierre Wayland from the Congo. So there went my plans of going to Cape Town University. The last few days of school were like one long day. We partied all night, visited all day, and I know the college staff were glad to put us all on the train home. Wally and I were headed for Francistown, and we slept until we got to Bloemfontein, where all the girls from the Catholic boarding school got on. Then all the partying started again. We danced to the Beatles, Chubby Checker, and even did some slow dances to Jim Reeves. The girls were all boy crazy, and though I had never dated, I enjoyed being around girls. They loved to tease me, being so naive, and I loved it. In Francistown, after staying with Wally's folks for 3 days, we hitched a ride on a lorry carrying salt up to Morn. Today it is a 5 or 6 hour trip. Then it took us 3 days driving day and night. During the day, we had to stop every half hour to let the tires cool, as the sand was so hot it may have burst the tires. As it was, a couple burst anyway. Right. Just going to get my tea. Get some sugar. Dash of milk. Cheers. Lovely. All right. Going through the Makadikari salt flats, we saw a great herd of approximately 40,000 springbok, hundreds of zebra, thousands of wildebeest, and each flock of ostrich had at least 300 birds in it. I never saw it like that again. A few months later, I sat on the escarpment overlooking the Queen Elizabeth National Park in Uganda with Mr. Temple Perkins, author of the book Kingdom of the Elephant. He had cataracts by then and couldn't be bothered to have them fixed, but he could feel the elephants migrating. He said to me, "Have a good look, my boy. There should be about 3,000 elephants stretching between the Kayambura to the north and the Kigezi forest to the south. I can't see them, but they always migrate this time of year. With this change of politics coming, we are going to lose these elephants." He mumbled a few curses against Milton Obote, the Prime Minister. And looking back, one didn't need to be a prophet to know what was going to happen. The next year, Idi Amin came into power and had his troops slaughter all the elephant, his idea being to sell all the ivory and clear the national debt. And so it was also in Botswana, where political changes made it impossible to see herds of game along the road to mourn. Beyond the Makadikari salt flats, the rains finally broke, and the road was like two watery tracks going through the desert. We stopped, and while the driver covered the salt with a tarpaulin, Wally and I danced around in the rain, and then realized that the ground was crawling with life. Huge bullfrogs, the size of dinner plates, had appeared, and were eating anything that was smaller than them, including each other. Snakes also appeared and were getting a good meal. I watched entranced as one bullfrog grabbed a 4-foot snake, and while still eating the snake, grabbed another small toad and engulfed it too. The herds of springbok went totally mad. They were trotting or prancing, bounding stiff-legged all over the place, with the hair raised on their backs. The animal behavior fundis say that this is a form of bonding. The wildebeest also played, much the same way horses do when they are feeling frisky. It was a wonderful time of celebration for nature, and we were part of it. That night, we ran over the biggest python I have ever seen. The bush was cleared 6 feet on either side of the road, and the road is 6 feet wide. We couldn't see the head or the tail, but we could see 18 feet of it. That is 6 meters. Yo, that is an enormous snake. We bumped over it in the truck, and I begged the driver to stop so that I could measure it. His eyes were huge, and he was mumbling something about crazy whites and ancestors all in one breath. Needless to say, we didn't stop. We only stayed in Morn long enough to find a ride up to Mahembo on another truck. Sitting on the back of the truck, we were able to enjoy the incredible bird life along the edge of the swamp. We had a 410 shotgun, which we had taken along to shoot our food. We had maize meal, but by itself, it's not too good. But with a bit of roasted meat, it suddenly becomes a meal fit for a king. We shot 2 Swainson's Franklin, and that night camped under a huge fig tree. I learned something that night. Don't cook your evening meal under the same tree you sleep under. I had scooped out a large trench in the sand to sleep in, putting my sleeping bag over the top so that I wouldn't be eaten alive by the mosquitoes. However, the smoke from the fire went up into the fig tree, and every large, hairy spider in that tree found refuge in the trench I had dug, with the sleeping bag over the top. We ate well, listened to a few stories around the campfire, and then went to bed. I thought my skin was crawling, but figured it must be in my head. Tried to go to sleep until I felt Tried to go to sleep until I felt the spider run across my face. I shot out of there suddenly, realizing what had happened. Pulling back my sleeping bag, I saw all these dreadful, huge spiders crawling about. On reaching Mahembo, I met Bobby Wilmot, who was already a famous character of the African bush. Books were written about his exploits, but in actual fact, he was a very normal person. We got on well, and I secretly fell in love with his niece, Ursula. She had all the qualities I felt necessary in a woman. She could pole her own makoro, the dugout canoe, shoot and skin an elephant on her own, cook over an open fire, and wasn't too crazy about fashion or makeup. The only problem was I had never had the nerve to tell her or let her know about how I felt about her. Bobby did teach me a lot about life, though. I talked to him a lot about the bush and how I would like to live in the bush. He simply said, if you want to live in the bush, yeah, then do it. He made his living shooting crocodiles in the Okavango. He was totally fearless. He did a lot of crazy things like leaping out of his Land Rover onto the back of a zebra, or marking a big X on an elephant's backside with a piece of chalk, or creeping into a pride of sleeping lions so that he can give out a big roar and terrify them all. But all these exploits have already been written about. He ended up stepping on a mamba early one morning after a night of shooting crocodile. In a few minutes he was dead. A good death for my mentor. Mahembo was separated from the swamp by a large river. I wanted to go into the swamp and start exploring right away. Wally wanted to stay and party with the Fosters and all their friends. So I decided to go on day excursions for a start. I would go fishing for bream on some of the inland waterways that coursed through the swamps. I had my binoculars and saw many new species of birds I had never seen before, as well as the very shy Sitatunga antelope. Evenings would find me coming back to the Fosters' home in Mahembo. One night I arrived back just after sunset and heard this most unusual snorting and blowing in the river. I was frightened, as I knew of how bad the hippo were, but this sounded different. I took the boat over to the bank and waited. Soon the local madman, crowned with a mop of dreads, came spluttering and blowing up out of the water. During the time Wally and I spent at Mahembo, we saw a makoro and its paddler lifted out of the water by an irate hippo. The makoro quickly reduced to matchsticks. Yet this madman used to swim regularly in the river, and neither the hippos nor the crocodiles would touch him. My excursions took me further and further into the swamps. One day I met one of the river bushmen. The bushmen usually lived out in the desert, but the river bushmen were taller and stayed in or along the swamps. His left hand had been chopped off, and using grunts and sign language, I asked him what had happened. Bushmen are artists at mimicking and acting. He showed me how a mamba had bitten him in the hand between his thumb and forefinger while he was cutting wood. Ignoring the snake, he put his hand up against a tree and chopped off his hand with one stroke of his axe, cauterizing the stump by sticking it into a fire. I saw him about a week after it had happened, and it was healing well. He no doubt saved his own life by taking this drastic action. I too wanted to be able to do that should the occasion arise, but just thinking about it would make me break out in a cold sweat. I would often go through the whole story in my mind of being bitten and chopping off my hand until I didn't sweat or feel faint. I believe that I could do that today, thanks to that little bushman. Now, I just need to hold on and tell you a little something there. So, I trained as a paramedic and did some training in remote rescue and snake bites. And yeah, we very highly recommend that you do not chop off a limb or a digit or something that's been bitten by a snake, even if you know that it was a venomous snake. Because first of all, venom travels via the lymph system, so it's you're not going to be able to chop it off fast enough to prevent envenomation. Secondly, you don't know that it was a venomous bite. Not always do venomous snakes deliver a venomous bite. Sometimes it's a dry bite, and you could die from blood loss or secondary infection more likely than from the snake bite. And yeah, also there's this other theory about electric shocks. Now, my dad was bitten by a black mamba back in the 90s, and he had heard that if you give yourself electric shocks, then it neutralizes the venom, you know. So he grabbed his cattle prodder, it was like 10,000 volts, and started zapping himself all over. And I mean, he miraculously survived. That's quite an incredible story. I'll have to tell it at some point. But yeah, basically, I always tell him that he didn't survive because of the cattle prodder. I think he survived in spite of the cattle prodder. Because the problem with electric shocks is, again, you're not going to catch the venom before it enters the lymph system and is already, transported away from the site of the bite. And detrimentally, electric shocks causes muscle contractures, which increases the flow of lymph. So you really are increasing the flow of venom around your system. So the best thing to do is put on a compression bandage on the site. No, never tourniquet. That's another thing. Never ever tourniquet. For the same reason you don't chop off a limb, because you very well could lose the limb from the tourniquet, and it's not going to stop envenomation. That's just not. So the best is to put on a pressure bandage and reduce movement as much as possible. And yeah, I mean, look, if you're out in the bush by yourself, then you're gonna have to make a plan. I don't know, maybe you think it's worth the risk to chop your leg off or something, But if you've got someone with you, then the best is to just minimize movement and have them monitoring your breathing. Because the snakes that'll kill you the fastest are the neurotoxic snakes, like mambas, cobras, night adders. And what that does is that paralyzes your muscles, paralyzes your breathing muscles, and then you go into respiratory arrest and then cardiac arrest. So the best is that they monitor your breathing and they assist you with ventilation, so mouth to mouth, until help can arrive or they can get you to help or something like that. Yeah, taking such drastic measures for a snake bite, wouldn't recommend it. Anyway, that's a bit of a side note, just because I don't want Bill's encounter with this bushman. Like I'm pretty sure that this bushman had got a dry bite from the mamba. No venom was actually delivered. Don't want people going around chopping off their leg just because they got bitten by a snake. They didn't even know what it was. Alright, onwards. I met up with a family of Mamba Kush tribesmen fishing in one of the lakes. I was invited to go with them to their village. This was cause for a party, as I was probably the first white man to ever stay in their village. There were the drums that called the surrounding villages. Then the party drums started to beat. The men sat in a circle and the women did the dancing. They faced the men, also in a circle, and completely naked. They had the most amazing muscle control, moving the muscles in their arms to the beat of the drum. Then, on an unseen cue, all their breasts started to bounce. They could do to the right, the left, and then both. In a slow shuffle, keeping time to the beat, they would all slowly turn around until their backsides were facing you, and do the same bouncing movement with their thighs and buttocks. This was enough to warm the blood of a dead person. Finally, it was the turn of the men. I had been stripped of my clothing and covered in charcoal stripes. With the drums beating, I could already feel the blood racing through my body. I danced the dance of the demented. I danced free all the hang-ups of school, failed matric exams, changed plans, and the requirements of white society. I don't remember finishing the dance. I only remember waking up the following day in a smoky hut next to a dead fire. I was supposed to be in Okavango for 2 weeks and then fly home to Uganda, but I somehow lost track of time. After 2 months, I was standing at the airstrip in Mahembo with Wally, watching the Wanela plane come in to return all the mine workers that had been working in the gold mines of South Africa. They came off the plane wearing sunglasses, hats, gaudy blankets, and carrying briefcases and sewing machines. Their families were all there to meet them, and it was a touching sight. On inspiration, I went up to the captain of the DC-6 and asked him if he would give me a lift. "So where are you going, sonny?" he asked in a heavy Scottish brogue. "Wherever you're going, sir," I replied. And so I managed to hitchhike my first airplane. In 45 minutes, Wally and I had gone what took us a week to do, travelling day and night in those salt trucks. From Francistown, I hitchhiked to Johannesburg. The family had given me the lift, putting me up for the night. My plane didn't leave for Entebbe until the next day, so they let me sleep in their lounge. I slept in my sleeping bag, and in the morning the whole family came into the lounge in their dressing gowns to have tea and chat. I was naked in my sleeping bag. They told me to get up and join them. I stood up in my sleeping bag and hopped to the bathroom to put on a pair of shorts. This seemed to amuse them greatly, to the point that all the kids in their late teens took me to town and took great delight in seeing my reaction to things city people experience on a daily basis. On the bus from Entebbe to Kampala, an elderly American couple were sitting across the aisle from me. They seemed very curious about everything they saw. The lady turned to me and asked, "Are they having a holiday here? The ladies' costumes are so colorful." "No, ma'am, that's the Ugandan national dress. They wear it all the time." I'd never thought it to be different because I was so used to it. "Do you often travel by yourself?" asked Leo. I knew his name was Leo because I read it on the tag of his suitcase. "Yes, sir. I go to school in Cape Town in South Africa and do this trip every year." "You seem so young," said the lady. I always hated that. "And you are so polite. Did they teach you that at school?" "No, ma'am. I learned it at home." I didn't mention all the hidings I got. "Your father must be very proud of you," the old man beamed at me. I didn't say anything, as I wasn't used to strangers talking like that to me. They asked me all kinds of questions, and I was able to answer all of them, particularly those about the bush. When we got to Kampala, they offered me a meal when I helped them to take their suitcases off the bus. I gladly accepted, and we went to the dining room of the hotel. I had a superb meal and was most grateful to them. At the end, they ordered drinks, and I had some tea. We talked softly, and then the old man turned to me and with moist eyes said, "We had a son just like you." He stopped and looked out the window. "We would love to correspond with you," said the wife. "Let me give you our address." I took a taxi home. 8 of us squashed into a Peugeot 404 sedan. 210 miles for 8 shillings, the equivalent of $1.10 US. During the trip home, I kept thinking about the old couple I had met, and it bothered me that they could make me feel so bad for them because they had lost their son. I took their address and mashed it up into a little ball, flicked it out of the window. I didn't think of them for a whole year, and then I realized one day, as I remembered them, that I could have been a help to them, kind of like a substitute for their son, and it really would have been nothing for me to write them a letter. Getting home was wonderful. My poor folks had been so worried about me and hadn't a clue where to start looking. So they waited, and when I did show up, Mum was hugging me and beating me at the same time. I went straight into guiding again in the national parks and hunting in the Kayambura. Helderberg would not accept me back again. Uganda started to fall apart, and it was then that Paddy went to France. She convinced me that it would be good for me to join. She convinced me that it would be good for me to go back to school, so I went and joined her in France. It was to be a very short spell, ending after only 6 weeks. I was then asked to get my letters at a different address, and by then Patty had moved to America. My first stop was in New York. I wasn't very good on the telephone, as usually Patty did any phoning that needed to be done. I did know that the information operators were something like God. They would never give you their name, you never saw them, they talked in this no-nonsense type voice, and they knew everything, even down to how many minutes to bake a potato. I had a half-day layover in New York, and remembered that Leo lived in New York. And remembering that Leo lived in New York, thought I would take a chance with information. Ma'am, I'm looking for this chap by the name of Leo. He is quite old and went to Uganda in 1965. Can you find his telephone number for me, please? There was a silence on the other end of the line, and then, where do you come from, sir? I used to live in Ishaka, near Bushenyi in Uganda, madam. Well, sir, when I find his number, I'll call you, in Uganda. A small chuckle escaped from the unseen operator. Thank you, madam. I hung up, and then realized that I had had my leg pulled. Sorry, Leo, for letting my immaturity get in the way of understanding you. Had I been more thoughtful, you would have always been the cherry on the cake of my first expedition. All right, there we have it. Phew, that was quite long with my story in the middle about snake bites. So I'll end it there. Good night, sleep well. See you tomorrow.